Hi, I'm Jimmy Colefax, and this is The Story. Today, our guest is once again Phil Fusco. Before the break, we heard how he became Christian singer Steve Grace's manager when he was only in his 20s. Next, Phil's life changes direction as he goes in the advertising industry. Also, he helps create Australia's branch of the International Christian Chamber of Commerce, otherwise known as the ICCC. Phil's chatting with Eric Scatterbo.
So next, I'm expecting you to say, and then I went on to manage Steve for the next 20 years or so, but we know that that's not the way you went. You went in another direction and end up in Dubai. So how did that all come about?
Yeah, well, Dubai came a little bit later, but I'll lead to that. So after Steve, a decision was made to, well, people drift apart, I suppose, for a better word. And so Steve went on to America and I stayed here and I went into the advertising industry and I then came, my mother again, so there's like a channel here. My mother heard about, Mum sees things ahead of the curve and I seem to pick up the wave and ride it. It's kind of a strange thing, but Mum heard about this movement. Now this is the Marketplace Ministry movement.
Oh, okay.
She heard about this organisation called, there already was the Full Gospel Businessmen's Association running in Australia, and in the women's circles it was called Women's Aglow. And that was the dominant male-female Christian expression back in those days, in the 80s. Anyway, the International Christian Chamber of Commerce was formed out of Sweden in Europe by a guy called Gunnar Olsson. And Gunnar was a Swedish industrialist in a plastics industry, but he was also the European president for the Full Gospel Businessmen's Association. And he had this tremendous vision and calling to set up a Chamber of Commerce to help Christian business people fulfill their role in a ministry sense in the community, in the body of Christ. And so Mum had heard this and I got exposed to the early thinking about this. Mum called a meeting at the law firm in Melbourne with a group called Moore's Law Firm. And pretty much everybody who was a Christian business person in those days was invited. Kimberly Smith from the accounting firm that was in the same building as Moore's.
Yep. He was my accountant at one time.
Was he?
Or his firm anyway.
Well, Kim Smith was Steve Grace's accountant.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I brought Kim in to handle Steve's accounts in the very beginning.
Oh, wow.
Purely from this network of just Melbourne Christian people.
Oh, okay.
So there's a lot of history there. So we're all there at Moore's Law Firm and just listening to this message of a guy called, I think it was Graham McLennan was his name, not to confuse it with the other Graham McLennan I just mentioned. And he shared this calling. And so while it resonated with us, nothing germinated at that point. A year later, I was going to Europe and I'd done this course in international business and I was going to Spain and to do my first deal. And so I said, look, I'm going to go to into Belgium and I'm going to meet this guy on the board of ICCC. And this guy at that time was called Emile van Beckenvoort. And he was professor in the universities in Belgium. And anyway, so I went and saw Emile, and who was one of the founding directors of ICCC. And Emile said to me, Phil, you've come all this way to meet me, to ask me and find out about ICCC. He said, the Lord is talking to you. You ought to go back to Australia and set it up. And so I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I went back with a mission and a purpose and basically sat down with the burden, because now I'm thinking to myself, okay, this is an interesting one now. So I'm not longer just doing a youth group Easter concert at Doncaster Shopping Town.
and then suddenly
I'm not
you're
handling
setting
Steve
up,
Grace now.
Yeah, you're setting up the International Christian Chamber of Commerce in Australia.
Now it's Thunderbirds on go. It's like, where does this go now? Yeah. So I sat there and prayed. I asked a good friend of mine, Tony Rule, a great friend of mine, his father, Brian Rule. I met them in church. I went to Blackburn Baptist Church in my 20s. I talked earlier about how you find your own way. I found myself back into the Baptist Church and went to Blackburn Baptist Church, which then became Crossway, as we know now, next to World Vision there. And so the Rule family is great entrepreneur, business family and Christians, and they hired me as a marketing contractor to basically do all their marketing for a project they did. And Tony Rule became a good friend of mine, Brian's son, and Melissa, his wife, Melissa Rule, all good family friends, and even Melissa's father knew my mother when they were young and born and things like that. It's a lot of history there. And anyway, so Tony and I got together and tried to work out what are we going to do to launch ICCC. And I decided I had contacts. I would join the Australian Marketing Institute, if you can bear with me, during my 20s. And I found myself on the the council of the AMI, which is the peak body for marketing in Australia. And I was the youngest guy at that time to be on that body, which was a great honour. And it was where I was trying to discover my marketing talents and look for opportunities. But basically, part of my role, just bear with me as I crisscross a couple of things here, because it also dubs in together. When I was with the Australian Marketing Institute, they had carried a 60-year-old debt, and myself and a guy called George Norris, a wonderful man that was a bit of a mentor to me. Those in Melbourne will know him, had his own radio program for years, maybe still does. He's a great business coach and mentor. And he and I together sort of devised we're going to have to get the AMI out of debt. So basically he raised money from Telstra and I raised money from Australia Post. Cleared this 60-year-old debt.
Oh, wow.
Together our board, if you wish, then created what's known as the CPM program, the Certified Practicing Marketer program, which is now the industry benchmark. If you're a marketer in this country, you should get your CPM qualifications, a bit like a CPA in accounting. And so we pioneered a lot of stuff in those days. And I'm only in my 20s, in my mid-20s now, 26, 27, but very much at the foreground of my industry. And I was made a fellow by the time I was 29, great honour as a young guy because of my contribution to the marketing industry. And anyway, it was through that contact with Australia Post, I had these connections. And so when I was trying to work out how to launch ICCC, I went to Australia Post and said, can you guys help me? And so basically they underwrote a complete mail out for me.
Oh, wow.
I got hold of the database of every church in Melbourne.
Oh, wow.
And I'd majored in direct marketing in my marketing studies, and so very much a forerunner for digital marketing. So I had this ability in writing, in scribing things, to communicate to people. So I wrote this letter, and I addressed the letter to the pastors, and we did this mass mail out to 300 churches across Melbourne, all denominations, basically saying to the pastor, because I knew the Spirit would be talking to somebody out there, I just didn't know who they were. And so I appealed to the pastor as a pastor shepherding his flock. You know who's in your congregation that the Lord is calling and is raising up or has a gift and talent in business. If you do, send them along as your ambassador, okay, to come along and to listen to this message. Well, sure enough, we had a huge turnout, like about 1,000 people turned up. Again, I used the network in front of me. So Backburn Baptist Church, through, I mentioned Brian Rule, Tony Rule's wife, Melissa Rule. Her father was David Jenkins. David Jenkins was the chairman of World Vision in those days. And David arranged for us to take World Vision's headquarters and use the whole ground floor foyer as a conference room.
Oh, wow.
And so we packed out the whole ground floor of World Vision there on Springvale Road. And then the board flew into Australia and addressed the audience. And out of that, the board handpicked, after meeting people one-on-one, handpicked people and raised them up and formed the first board for ICCC Australia. And then it commenced. And so I was part of that first board of ICCC in Australia as a director. The president was made, who was the past or current at the time president of the Full Gospel Businessmen Association of Australia, a wonderful accountant, management consultant, all since passed away. And these are wonderful, pioneers of the faith, basically. And the Lord just assembled them together. Robert Palmer, who has a finance background, he was on the board. And John Cromie, who had a technology background. And we all came together to form the first board of ICCC Australia.
And I imagine you were the youngest one on that board, is that right?
Yes, I was the youngest one on that board.
Oh, wow. A mover and shaker and the youngest one.
And then events unfolded. So I was there for about a year. We basically pioneered it. I mentioned the Rule family. We just launched this major project with the Rule family, and Brian Rule went on to Singapore. And Brian said to me, Phil, there's an opportunity in Indonesia. Why don't you come up here? And so this again is the Lord sort of leading you in this sort of journey. And this was like the third turning point, if you wish, in my life. So here I am now. I'm at the top end of my 20s. I'm punching way above my weight and filling in the gaps as I go. My mother always told me when I was a young man, don't be afraid to visualize what you want to become or be. As time unfolds, you will grow into and fill that void, that space to become what you feel led to be. And so I was never afraid. My parents never always encouraged us to, take a risk. Don't be afraid to jump in the deep end because you'll learn to swim pretty quickly. And it was that sort of attitude, if you wish. So I was always willing to I call it youthful idealism as it is.
Yeah.
Years later, just jumping quickly, with the Young Entrepreneurs Organisation, and we did global research on the qualities of successful entrepreneurs, and one of the qualities was ignorance. I know it sounds funny, but this is an encouragement to anyone in business or starting off that you don't have to know everything up front. If you knew everything, you'd be too scared to even start. And so what we find is that entrepreneurs that make it, they just take it day at a time, and they just fight every battle day by day, because if you saw the battles ahead, and there's obviously a lot when you're trying to build a business or take a risk, it can also become overpowering it, you know what I mean? And so think about God. He knows so much.
Yeah.
And if we had the mind of God or saw what he saw, we could not handle it.
Right.
That's a fact.
Well, I would think that
don't
faith,
be afraid.
Yeah, I would think that faith would be an advantage, because you're going to have battles, but you know that if you're trusting in the Lord, he's going to help you overcome those battles.
Absolutely correct. The walk of faith is absolutely crucial. And so they seem oversimplified, but it is that simple. So if you think about humility and faith, they're the two keys basically that can just carry you. And it's a principle of life too. You don't have to be a Christian for these principles to apply.
Yeah. Now, moving back to your personal story, you eventually went to Indonesia. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So here's Brian saying to me, Phil, look, there's an opportunity here. It's a little bit of a big step for you, but you'll never look back, he said to me.
Okay.
So I thought, okay, I'm just, operating, at a small level here. Again, if you go back to my original views as a kid about we're called to be in the world, not in, you know what I mean? So I didn't want to be this big fish in a small fishing bowl. I wanted to be in the world. That's how I felt led. And I must admit, even before we delve into Asia, I suppose, that after Steve's Grace album with Word Records, Stan Moulton graciously actually offered me a full-time job with them. And I seriously, and this is important because it comes back to where I am right now with the organisation I'm with, that was a sliding door moment. And I often said to myself over the years, did I make the right decision? He literally said, Phil, he was happy, obviously. He trusted me. We'd just done this album. You know what I mean? It was all going well. He said, Phil, why don't you join Word Australia? We need someone to run our books division. You could travel the world, go all the book conferences, da-da-da-da. And I thought to myself, Christian organisation, you know what I mean? Small fish pond. I don't want to be a big fish in a small pond. Like my attitude was wrong. It was again, that youthful exuberance, like you sort of see yourself being something that you're not, but you have to sort of start somewhere. And so I said thank you, but no thank you. But I will be frank, over the years I often wondered whether I made the wrong decision. And the fact that I'm where I am now, and we'll come to that obviously soon, I kind of feel like the Lord's brought me full circle in many different ways. So just park that for the moment.
So basically the decision was full-time ministry or being a light in the darkness of the secular marketplace, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I felt we're meant to be in the world to make a difference.
Well, that was part 2 of Eric Scatterbo's conversation with Phil Fusco, who's sharing his eventful life journey with us. As we heard in the second half of today's conversation, Phil became involved in the marketplace ministry movement in Australia in the 1980s, and he helped create Australia's branch of the International Christian Chamber of Commerce, otherwise known as the ICCC. For more information, the ICCC's website is simply ICCC.net. Once again, that's ICCC.net. Finally, as we heard, Phil was led to be a Christian in the secular marketplace and let his light shine. As Jesus said, we are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Therefore, we have been called by God to bring light in the darkness in his name throughout our lives, wherever we may be. So it's not just for people in ministry or missionaries to represent the Christian faith, but it's for all of us in whatever profession we may be in. We can all let our light shine before men. Well, next time we'll hear how Phil's next big adventure is overseas as the Lord leads him to Asia. That's all coming up next time as Phil Fusco continues sharing his story. Until then, I'm Jimmy Colefax, encouraging you to share your story with someone today.
Next time on The Story.
I climbed to the top of the pyramid as a CEO. I was 35 at the time, and then tipped off the top of the pyramid like everybody else in the late 90s with the Asian financial crisis. So from there I went back to Australia and then climbed my way back up, and where I ended up in Dubai. from Dubai, I was then offered a CEO role back in Singapore 10 years later, which I did. And then the global financial crisis came.
Phil Fusco joins us once again to share more of his life journey and how the Lord has led him on many adventures, including overseas in the secular marketplace. We'll also hear how the Lord leads him back into ministry after a short stint in Australian politics. That's all coming up next time.
The Story. Just another way Vision is helping you look to God daily.